So back in my college mixing classes, my professor would always draw up this diagram for us. This triangle represents the song being produced, and all of this is the production and creation of the song. And this little bit accounts for the mixing. And this tiny little guy up here is the mastering. The point of this is to show how much more the production matters over the mixing and mastering. But from this diagram, it kind of looks like mixing and mastering barely matter at all, right? What do you think? Do you agree? I know it's a bit of a bold claim. While I personally wouldn't say mixing and mastering don't matter, I do think that the composing aspect takes a higher priority, as that's where most of the soul, I guess, of the composition lies. In my opinion, an amazing mix can't save a bad song, because the song is the main thing. However, that means if you have an amazing song, and then you do an amazing mix, well, that's double amazing. So with that being said, this video is all about how I mix and master my music. I'll be working in Ableton Live 11, so a bunch of the specifics I'm gonna say apply to Ableton, but every software in DAW has its own version of what I'm gonna be explaining. And just as like when I use Pro Tools, for example, I just do the same thing, just in Pro Tools. So let's get started. I'll play a bit of the song to give you some context. This is the unmixed version, so keep that in mind for later. So once my song is fully written, it's time to power on the speakers and do some critical listening. Notice how I said critical? Very important. This whole process is about listening, so use your ears. And seriously, I can't stress that enough. You don't need a bunch of visual indicators to make your song look cool, it needs to sound cool. So trust your ears. I first listened through the song as is, kind of making mental notes of things I hear that could be changed. These changes include stuff like, oh, the piano's a bit too loud here, so I'll turn it down. Or, the mallets are ringing a lot, I'll cut out some high frequencies. The first thing I do when I start making changes is usually in the drums. Once I switch from headphones to speakers, I can hear the low end more, as well as a more pronounced version of the mid and high frequencies. And they are usually too loud. So I bring them down, often quite a lot. If you're able, I'd always recommend mixing on speakers or out loud. While headphones are the primary listening device for most people just chilling to music, mixing solely on them can make the transition to the out loud world a bit jarring. Again, that non-existent low end could shake your whole room. But also, I don't want to discourage anyone if you can only mix on headphones. That's what I did for years. Years. Just keep that low end in mind. That's basically the point I want to make. Anyway, so I just continue to let the song play as I move around and make adjustments. I tried changing tracks up and down a couple dB to see what I like and how that affects its sound with the other parts. Usually a difference of 1 or 2 dB can be perceived as an audible difference to most listeners. Anything less than 1 is just, well, there's not much of a point if you can't tell the difference, you know? So yeah, I'm just listening as the song goes. That's what it's all about, really, just listening. It probably looks like not a whole lot is happening on screen, because I'm literally just sitting and listening. In addition to listening to stuff volume-wise comes a little bit of EQing. This is how I cut out unwanted frequencies to isolate the best version of each instrument I use. I play around with this a lot in my mixing process. So I tend to like to mix for consistency. There's never too much of the lowest or the highest ends of the frequency spectrum. Oh my god. The frequency spectrum in my stuff. I just like to have it all nice and nice, you know what I mean? Luckily, Ableton's EQ8 actually, yeah, EQ8, has a little graphic to show you where the frequencies are. That's what you can see in the bottom left throughout this mixing session. Well, this is fantastic. I don't usually focus on the visual much because, again, it's about listening. It took me over a year to understand and develop my ears enough to the point to understand what needs to be cut and what doesn't. It's a skill that definitely comes with time, and I still work on improving it every day. 'Cause not gonna lie, it's a bit tricky. But some EQ stuff that stays consistent throughout most of my songs are cutting out all the lowest lows on the bass drums, brass and strings, the highest highs on the tambourines, cymbals, and mallets, as well as a few peaks in the middle for stuff like choir and high trumpet. This way, there's no earthquakes or no sounds of like a tornado siren when you listen to my stuff. You don't need to wince, I guess. It's just, what did I say earlier? Nice and nice, you know? To illustrate my point, I'll play you some parts with and without EQ. The non-EQ stuff will sound a little bit gross, so heads up if your volume is high or using headphones. Same idea applies for drums and stuff too, the cymbals in particular. Pretty big difference, right? And obviously when your sessions end up as huge and tons of orchestral pieces like mine, that ringing and unneeded noise stacks up very quickly, clouding up your work. And of course, all of this is happening while I listen, making the changes live. Seriously, it's all about listening. I'm just gonna keep on saying that because it's just about listening and do what you think sounds good, seriously. Once the song is a little more cleaned up, I start adding in some automation in the form of fading in and out with volume. I do this to build up stuff for dramatic effect, but also balance sections or mute everything for a sound effect drop or something. The volume automation is represented by the red lines I'm adjusting on each track. My personal favorite is fading in legato string parts because I like to imagine a section of string players slowly using their bows and playing with all that gusto, you know? Volume automation can be a really nice gloss to add to a song, as well as being quite fun to incorporate. However, I probably don't use as much as I could, as I just play the parts at the volume I want them to be when I'm recording them live. If I want a piano part to be softer, I'll just play it a little softer, you know? I suppose that's a prime example of how the soul of the composition, the soul of the composition would be in the composing stage more than the mix, you know? In my opinion. But I also use volume automation at the end of every song to make sure all the tracks fade out, so nothing gets cut off when I export the finished song. Makes it sound a little, not awkward. You can also use automation to change your audio effects and various other things, but I usually just stick to volume. I like to keep it simple and consistent. Yeah. Many other music producers or mixing engineers have a lot more going on in their mixing sessions, but again, I like simplicity. Like I said before, most of the creativity for me personally comes from the writing of the song itself. For me, this is just the polishing phase. Speaking of polishing, comes the mastering process. In short, mastering is just the final layer of sprinkles and spice that make the whole composition louder and therefore more exciting. I've mentioned it before actually, but I have a template that I made that I just insert into every song to use as a starting point. and that template, it looks like this. I personally love this because it looks so advanced and cool. So advanced and cool, in fact, that when my landlord came in to my place for like a safety inspection or something, she walked by my keyboard setup with all these crazy visuals and charts on the screen, and she was like, "What are you doing?" She had obviously never seen anything like it before, so I told her, "Clearly I'm hacking into NASA." And we had a pretty good laugh about it. But back to mastering. Just a warning, some technical info incoming as I explain what each of these pieces does. First is this utility. This usually goes untouched in most of my mixes, and I only adjust it when I really need a gentle song to come up and get louder to hit a peak volume of minus 0.30 decibels. This is just so all of my songs, bombastic or soft, are always the same volume. I should clarify though that only the peak or biggest part of the song needs to hit that ceiling, not the whole song. That would be like reading a story that's only climax the whole way through. Anyway, if I'm writing a piano solo, it'll feel much quieter than a full orchestra, so I might add 2 dB to the utility's gain output to get it loud enough. Otherwise, it just chills at 0. After that is another EQ, cutting out all of the extreme lows. This is just another layer of what all the tracks already have. I already caused one earthquake with an unmixed track, so I always put it there for safety. Kinda tidies up the mix too. After that is this multi-band dynamics and OTT, or over the top. They're kind of just 2 pieces of the same thing. They bring up the perceived brightness of the mix, and this helps in making things sound louder and bigger. We often think louder and bigger is better, which I wouldn't say is entirely incorrect. I will mention though that I have these set at pretty low amounts though. OTT is kinda like salt. A bit of it adds tons of flavor and intrigue, but too much of it can ruin a food altogether. Or in the case of mixing, it'll often sound like you're listening to the song on the phone while you're waiting on hold. And if you're unsure of how much of an effect to use, whether that be OTT or compression or distortion, a trick I like to use is just crank it to 100% so you can hear the extreme, and then slowly bring it back down until you find a point that you're happy with. That way you can know that you're making a difference with the effect without overcompensating. Next is this saturator. Again, this is for brightness. I use an analog clip to keep the effects of it subtle, and usually have the drive at about 3 to 5 decibels. I'll usually raise this if my song isn't loud enough, that utility from before being the backup. This is just adds a more exciting sound that comes with more loudness and brightness. And finally is the limiter. When I'm listening, I'm usually looking at this guy right here. This prevents my song from going over my ceiling of the previously stated negative 0.30 decibels, or redlining. I usually have the gain set to 3 to 8 decibels in order to get my songs loud enough, but never too loud. You always want to have that happy middle point, you know? The limiter is also good for checking any loss in dynamics, but usually isn't an issue for me personally, as I play each part pretty carefully and, I guess, organically would be the word I'm looking for. And yeah, that's my mastering chain. You're more than welcome to yoink my settings if you'd like to try them. These values aren't at all set in stone. I just adjust whatever I need for whatever song I'm working on. But like 95% of the time, it's just the default settings with a few tweaks to the limiter. So that all looks very cool, right? But what's more important than looking cool? Sounding cool. Took me a really long time to understand that there's no perfect formula for creating a perfect mix and master every time. You have to listen, and you have to know what to listen for. And more often than not, many problems can be solved with just adjusting the volumes. The values of whatever effects you choose, and the project you do, it'll just always be different. In college, we had a whole semester dedicated to learning how to mix and master, learning all these fancy tricks and techniques, all while our professor continued to tell us that none of it mattered and just make good music and listen. In our weekly mixing challenges, I would just adjust the volumes and nothing else, often having a more balanced mix than those who went ham with effects. Keep stuff simple, listen closely, and it'll be great. What I did for a mix on this track is quite simple compared to what it could be for sure, but I'm happy with it because I like simplicity. Back when I first got into composing, I would approach the process very mathematically as I did when learning repertoire while studying piano privately. I'm definitely no scientist or mathematician, but I've always tended to view things as patterns and formulas, and I guess I still do to an extent, but nowadays I'm much more just do it and have fun, you know? So even though I just did a whole explanation on my mixing process, if you take anything away from this video, it's to listen and have fun. So now, the moment we've all been waiting for. Let's listen to some of the mix now that it's mixed and mastered. I'll also compare the unmixed version so you can hear the difference. Pretty neat, right? That's my process. But obviously, every producer will have a totally different way of doing things, as well as a workflow that works best for them and their work. But this was just me showcasing my own way, in case that can help anyone. And that's about everything, too. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, cheers, guys!